Welcome back to what will be the last book review for a while because I'm pretty well caught up on most of the things that I've read. I don't like to beat around the bush, so I'm just going to go ahead and hop into the review. Today, we're going to start out with reviewing The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I personally have seen all six movies, The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies and all of that, but I've only read this book from this universe. And I was kind of surprised, well, not really surprised, that they turned this one skinny little book into three separate movies. I mean, the material was definitely there, and I think they made it work. But there again, it was still surprising to see the first movie end as early as it did when I first watched it. And I really wasn't thinking, like, oh, it's already been a couple of hours. We still got all of this book left to go through, but it's actually a really good book and it shows a lot of origins of various famous items from the Lord of the Rings series. And one interesting detail that I enjoy about the book is that, thinking back to the movies, Frodo went through his adventures and wrote the book, The Lord of the Rings. And Bilbo, which is one of his relatives, went through his adventures and wrote the book There and Back Again, which is the other name for this book. So they're the same story, just under a different name. And so basically, you find Bilbo living his normal life in the Shire and everything, and then Gandalf comes a knocking and turns everything upside down, and he has a pack of dwarves with him, and they're all on a mission to return to their old ancestors' home, which is called Lonely Mountain. And there was a kingdom underneath this mountain that was full of vast riches and everything. And the most popular of which was something called the Arkenstone, which is like an heirloom for Thorin, who's kind of like the main leader of the dwarves. And his last name, I believe, is Oakenshield. It's been a while since I've read this book. But they're on a mission to return to this mountain and claim the Arkenstone and therefore claim the former glory that the dwarves had over that portion of the land. But the problem is that the dwarves way back in the day were forced out of this home by a dragon that pretty much made that place his home. And just so people don't come after me in the comments, I'll make sure I pronounce his name correctly. The dragon's name is Smaug, not Smog, like what a lot of people mess up. So there you go. Hope you're happy. But basically, they go through a whole slew of adventures and encounter a variety of different characters like dwarves, elves, orcs, the whole nine yards. And I know it was explored more in the movies, the storyline with the necromancer and all of the wizards going to battle him, but that wasn't really heavily explored in this book. And as you can tell, because of how thin it is, you basically have Gandalf drop out of the story for a while and he goes and takes care of this thing, and then suddenly he's back later on. Like they don't really talk about what happens while he's away. But this is also the story where Bilbo finds the sword Sting that eventually he gives to Frodo and all that. And if you remember, that sword glows blue when it's in the presence of goblins or orcs, things like that. And so the first movie was called An Unexpected Journey. So that's pretty much where Gandalf whisks him away and tempts him on this big, grand journey to go along with these dwarves. And you run into Gollum again. He's a fun character. I love how Andy Serkis, or Serkis, however you pronounce that last name, portrays that character. Yeah, he just does an excellent job. Really enjoyable character. But you encounter him in this book and you find out how exactly Bilbo gets a hold of the One Ring, only you don't exactly know that that's what that ring is in this story yet. And it's just really fascinating how events play out, and their little battle of riddles they had between the two of them was a lot of fun. But the second movie, which is called The Desolation of Smaug, which is where they finally get up to the mountain and disturb the dragon and cause a whole chain of events that doesn't exactly work out in their favor. And then you have the third movie, which is the Battle of the Five Armies. Now, it has been a while since I've read this book, but I do not recall there being this big grand battle at the end. I recall Bilbo happening across the Arkenstone and then turning it over to the elves and the men at the end there, like he does in the movie. And that pretty much being the catalyst that solves all the problems, if I am remembering it correctly. Don't yell at me. But Still, it was a very enjoyable book. And one last thing I'll leave you with on this is that he puts a lot of detail into it, including a map of just the overall journey that they took from point A to point B and all the different landmarks that are associated with it, which I thought was a fun little detail. But yeah, I highly recommend going out and getting this book for yourself, experience the story for yourself because it truly is one that you don't want to put down. So yeah, that's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, this next one is going to be part a book review and part a Kindle review because I was gifted a Kindle Paperwhite last Christmas. And it's the 11th generation, I believe. Yeah, Kindle Paperwhite. And because I finally got to a point where I've pretty much gotten through almost all of the books that I would rather have as books with their nice, cool looking covers and everything. And I started wanted to, I wanted to, let me try and learn English here. I started to want to hop into books that I didn't necessarily want to own physical copies of, but still wanted to see what was in them. And so that's where this comes in. And the Kindle itself is absolutely great. And I highly recommend it for any book reader that wants to download a bunch of books but don't want to take up too much space, physical space, that is. And it's also great because if you're next to a fan or outside in the wind, it's not constantly blowing your pages over and you're having to find your spot again if you're caught off guard. Um, there is one downside to it, but if it makes no difference to you, then it's whatever. And that's like with the book covers or any pictures that would be in the books. It's all going to be in black and white and all that. And as far as the screen itself, um, it does pretty good in the sun. There are other Kindles that do better in the sunlight and whatnot, but this one does a pretty darn good job. I can still read fairly easy, and I keep mine in dark mode, which is where the background's black but the words are white, and that works for me personally, whether I'm reading in the dark or reading in the daylight, and it is backlit as well, so you don't need an additional light source in order to read it. And you can adjust those settings as well. You can also adjust the shading of the pages as well. But yeah, highly recommend one of these, and it's been treating me good so far. So I've really been enjoying using it, and it's so lightweight too. But let's hop into the book that I intend to review, and that's going to be Stephen King's It. Huh. So I have a bit of mixed feelings about this book. This is I mean, it's probably one of the more popular Stephen King creations, if you will. And I have seen the two most recent movies that were made after this or adapted from it. Like, I haven't seen any of the original movies or shows or whatever they were. So I've only seen the newest stuff with this. And they did a pretty good job at certain things, adapting them into movies, but there were quite a few interactions with Pennywise the clown in the book that didn't make it into the movies, obviously. And I think honestly the reason for that is because this book was like 1175 pages long. Like, it took him 4 years to write this book, and it took me 4 months to read it. Now, granted, I've been doing a whole bunch of other projects on the side, but still, it took me 4 months to get through this book. And that's the thing with Stephen King and a lot of his books is that he not only just writes about the interesting stuff, he takes world building to an entirely new and almost unnecessary level with every single character and even the background characters. You get their entire life story and background and where they come from, what their motivations are, and what they've done in the past, etc., etc., to the point where it's like, oh my God, will you please just get to the point and move on to the next thing? Like, it gets pretty rough and slow in certain areas, and you have to just stomach those parts to get to the more interesting parts. And there are some really good and interesting parts. However, there are certain concepts and topics explored in this book. Like, I'm just going to come out and say it. Like, if you are a person who has suffered any kind of physical abuse in the past, this is definitely not the book for you. It more than likely will be very triggering. with some of the things that, like, because you're inside of the heads of some of the bad people in this book and the thoughts that they're having. And like, I'm not a fan of when people use the word disgusting to describe somebody's behavior. It's just, it seems like an improper use of the word. But honestly, some of the thoughts that I read in this book is nothing but absolutely disgusting in every way. And another thing I'll say is that he uses the N word an extreme amount of times in this book, and it's very off putting to constantly have to read past that word and everything else. And the only saving grace to that is that it's only the bad people in this book that are using that word, and when they get to a point where they meet their end or are absolutely slaughtered by a monster, the clown, it's just, it's super satisfying in that regard. But there again, I just don't find it necessary to say that word in text or vocalize it that many times. I don't care how bad of a person in a book is. It's just not necessary to make me think, oh, this guy's a bad person. I understand. But you also got to remember that this book was written many, many years ago. It was a very different time, and it's also portraying an older time as well. This book takes place primarily in two different points in times with several other flashbacks in between and before, but that's the 1950s and the 1980s. So you have the main cast of kids in the 1950s when they face the clown, and then 27 years later in the 80s when they're adults facing the clown again. And basically you have the main group of kids, and you know everybody knows the story. You have Georgie, who's taken by the clown, and he's the brother of one of the main characters, Bill. You also have Beverly, Ben, Eddie, Richie, Stan, and Michael, or Mike. And each of them have their own different struggles and problems that they're dealing with, and they're grappling with all kinds of things, and they're having to deal with this recurrent bully that is constantly giving them problems, but that bully's slowly going insane, and his antics are getting more and more dangerous and downright lethal. But more on the clown itself, Pennywise. The character itself is quite fascinating. So basically, what it is a creature that is able to take the form of what you fear most, and it uses that fear against you, and it basically kills you, but it feeds off of your fear. And that's why it targets children specifically. And let me just say, there were a few scenes in this book where I read, and at the end of it, I wasn't sure I could continue reading. And it literally made me think, like, oh my gosh, Stephen King, who hurt you? Like, how did this come out of your brain? And like, some of the, so a lot of the times when you see this book portrayed in a TV show or movie where someone's reading it and they're very jumpy and they hear sound and they act all scared, for me, this book didn't have that effect. I wasn't like jumping at sounds or anything. I didn't find the book itself scary. If anything, it was more of a psychological horror. Like, it just absolutely unsettles you in many different ways, but it's not scary in the normal traditional sense. And honestly, it was very tough just to get through it up until like the last 10% of the book, where they're adults. And that's the other side of this book, is that it literally, so like in the most two recent movies, the first movie takes place primarily in the 50s when they're kids, and they go through their whole adventure as kids and defeat Pennywise, whatever. And that's that. And then the second movie is primarily in the 80s when they come back as adults to face it once and for all. But the book, however, jumps back and forth between those two times repeatedly from beginning to end. And it's honestly a little discombobulating the way it's done, but it makes sense for what the book is trying to do. Because a lot of the events in both the 50s and the 80s repeat themselves or line up in certain ways to where it makes sense that he separated them in that way. Um, but going to like the last 10% of the book, you finally learn the true form of it. And that is something called the Deadlights. So basically, everything just gets so much more interesting the last 10% of the book. It gets truly like cosmic level stuff. So, pretty much before our universe existed, there was it and this other cosmic being known as the turtle. And basically, the turtle got a stomach ache or whatever and somehow birthed our universe into existence. And it found its way into this universe and landed on Earth and discovered a whole realm of imagination amongst us that it could use against us, pretty much, primarily with children. And when they face it in both the at the like the final battle in both the 50s and the 80s, it takes the form of this giant spider, which is kind of the conglomeration of all of our main characters' fears meshed into one. But it really becomes kind of world-ending level stuff, and it's like it's all or nothing at this point, at the point in time in the 80s, because not only do they realize this is their last chance to face it, but at the same time, it is actually female and it is pregnant with offspring, like it is laying eggs. And if they don't succeed now, then it's all over for pretty much everybody. And it really the way they explain all of existence is quite fascinating. So you have our universe, and outside of our universe, you have what they call the macroverse, which is like the space between universes. It's the void, if you will. And it's there that it truly exists as the Deadlights and is unkillable. It's only in our universe that it has taken a physical form to where it can be killed. And I guess that causes some kind of chain reaction that kills it in all of existence, inside and outside of our universe, whatever the case may be. But it had a pretty satisfying ending, I should say, as far as actually defeating it. But there was definitely a very weird scene with the kids, because there again it's jumping back and forth in time. In the 50s, after they faced it for the final time the first time, there's some things that the kids do with each other before they get out of the sewers, and it's quite honestly, it was just completely and totally off-putting, and I honestly do not know why he even chose to include this in the book. And honestly, I would not pick up and read this book again. That's just my honest opinion. It's fine for a first time reading if you got a strong mental stomach, if you will, for some of the themes that are explored in this book, but definitely would not read twice, especially with how long it took me to get through it. Another detail at the end of the 80s is that the book portrays like an almost complete and total destruction of Derry, which is where this book primarily takes place, while they're facing it for the last time. But at the end of the day, I mean, I guess it was a satisfying enough ending. But I mean, you can read it if you want to, just to see for yourself what's in it. But there again, like, unless you are mentally strong in certain aspects, I would not deign to read this one. Yeah, just read at your own risk. Yeah, read at your own risk is a good way to describe this book. But at the end of the day, at least everything seems to be resolved, but still, all those people are still going to be dead either way. But everybody who's still alive by the end of the story seems to have a bit of a happy ending, more or less, and everything just kind of gets wrapped up with a nice little bow, I should say. I mean, it better for as many details as he put into this thing. But all that I have to say. That's really all that I have to say for that book, and I think this will wrap the review up nice and tight. But yeah, go and check it out if you want. Read at your own risk. But there again, I highly recommend the Kindle version because it doesn't take nearly as much space, and you can just kind of like pick it up as you want. I will say, just a little disclaimer here. as far as the Kindle is concerned. Enter that at your own risk as well, because everybody I talk to, they keep saying that certain authors are starting to pull their product from Kindle services because they're not making as much money off of it or whatever. I don't know, it seems kind of a silly thing to do to me, because what if that causes somebody not to buy it at all? But that's just me. So I'm going to leave that book review here. Hope you guys enjoyed and tried to be as brutally honest as I could with this one. But yeah, in any case, I hope everyone has a great day. See you next time.